One, thank you for coming out this evening. Hopefully you weren't blinded by the light as you were driving in, but I'm glad that the weather held out for everyone. So I'm really excited to be back here. It's been about a year since last the International Women's Air and Space Museum was here at the Menor Public Library. Last year we did our history of women in air and space, so very much our bird's eye view. Like, we covered 200 years of history in like 1 hour. So thank you for those of you who braved coming back, knowing that we're going to cover a lot of information this evening, but this is one of our newer programs. So as Meg said, I joined the team at the International Women's Air and Space Museum during the pandemic, during November 2020. And boy, did we have our work cut out for us. One of the things that in talking to our trustees, talking to our volunteers, exploring, getting to really know the organization, is that the museum has such a unique story within history to tell, and so many different perspectives that we can share. So one of the things that we really started doing in that first year of my tenure at the museum was, let's take our general history of women in air and space and let's drill down. Let's share some of those stories that are left out of our textbooks, that are left out of our common community memory and narrative. So one of those programs, which we first launched in November, just before Veterans Day of 2021, was Women in the Armed Forces. Now, this is Women in the Armed Forces, and we're actually going to pull it forward. We know so much about World War II history. I have an entire program just on women in World War II aviation. And that I'm considering just making into an entire class at this point. But this program this evening, we're actually going to pull this forward. We're going to look post-World War II. Because oftentimes we kind of, that narrative gets lost in the shuffle because we're not in active wartime. We're in the Cold War. We're pulling it forward even to just last year, 2022. So again, a lot of time that we're going to cover. So please keep your arms and hands inside the tram at all times. So for those of you who are newer to the International Women's Air and Space Museum, show of hands. How many of you have heard of us? You guys knew I was going to ask that. You're like, yep, I know. For those of you who we are less familiar to you, the International Women's Air and Space Museum is the only museum of its kind in the world dedicated to the preservation, education, and inspiration of our communities about the experiences and culture of women in all areas of air and space. So that means if you are working in like media relations, like Catherine Wright was, you have a place in aviation history. If you are an engineer, if you're a data analyst, if you work even for, let's say, Sherwin-Williams as an engineer designing the paint that is used on our planes, guess what? That's part of air and space history. So it's really women in all areas of air and space history, and that is what sets us apart. We've been around for 47 years. This August. We've been in Cleveland for 25 of those years, inside Cleveland's Burke Lakefront Airport. So if you're driving on the Shoreway, if you're heading towards a Browns football game, if you're heading downtown to the Science Center, if you're heading over to Playhouse Square for a show, you actually drive, odds are, past Burke Lakefront Airport. And we are inside the concourse. We take up about 2/3 of the concourse itself with exhibits. And you can see on the slide here just some of the exhibits that we have. And this is a picture of our newest display. This is just a section of our Quest for the Stars exhibit that opened in October of 2022 that explores the role of women in our early space program from 1955 to 1978. Those are very specific years because 1978 was the first time we had women a part of the astronaut corps, where we had Sally Ride, Anna Fisher, no relation, Shannon Lucid, Ray Seddon, Judy Resnick, and Kathy Sullivan joined the ranks of our astronaut corps. So we end in that year, but we start in 1955 when Clevelander Annie Easley began her career at what is now NASA's Glenn Research Center, before NASA was NASA. So I encourage you to come down and check out the exhibit because it was a years-long process. But we have exhibits on Connie Luda, like I mentioned earlier, on Margaret Hurlburt, who was from Painesville, as well as Bessie Coleman, Amelia Earhart, because we can't have an Air and Space Museum without talking about Amelia Earhart, right? The WASP and more, and we're working on an aerial nurses exhibit right now. So that is our next labor of love to share, because that has a lot of Ohio connections and a lot of Northeast Ohio connections as well. We do also have a variety of programs. So our next program is Trivia Night. We are partnering with Southern Tier Brewing Company in downtown Cleveland off of Prospect Avenue, and all the proceeds from trivia are going towards our educational programs. So we welcome K-12 students throughout the year for field trips. We're going to the classrooms to supplement what the teachers are already expected to cover in their classes, etc. So we do different versions of these programs like the one this evening, as well as hands-on experiences for folks. So if you're interested in coming down to trivia, we'd love to have you. Southern Tier has a lot of great food too, so I'm looking forward to that, because I don't get to actually participate. I get to create the questions, and I can just like stuff my face with food. But again, all the proceeds are going towards our educational programs. So without further ado, tonight's objectives. So this evening, like I mentioned just a few moments ago, we are going to be exploring women's roles within predominantly the U.S. military. So it's a little bit more closer to home for us. So we are going to get to know a handful of some of the women post-World War II and up to today that have had a role within air and space history and also have served our country through the armed forces. We're going to also understand the significance of their experiences and understand, what was happening in the 60s, what about in the 80s, and how about even now. So you'll get to meet a woman, Amanda Lee, near the end of this presentation, and why she's so significant. Just show of hands, how many of you have heard of Amanda Lee? Yes, okay, you get to learn about her. We kind of had a freak out in August of 2022, and okay, teaser, we ran over to the Cleveland National Air Show offices and we're like, did you? And they're like, yes. And we're like, okay. I've had a lot of coffee today too, so please just bear with me. It's starting to it's just starting to come back again. So before we really get started with post-World War II, we kind of need to know what was happening during World War II to really understand the context and the significance here. So I'm just going to breeze through this. Again, this is, with World War II, we have an entire program that we just drilled down, and that's all we talk about. And we talk about women in the Soviet Union in that program. We talk about women in Great Britain. We talk about women in Japan. We talk about women in Hong Kong. And here, that's a whole nother program. So if you, please let the library know if you want us to come back and talk about that. We're happy to. So just kind of a bird's eye view here. During World War II here in the US, we had women serving, you've heard of Rosie the Riveters. You probably have learned maybe about the women who were building parts for the B-29s at the Fisher Body Plant number 2, which is now the IX Center in Cleveland. But within the armed forces, we had more military adjacent women involved in the war effort, including the WASP, Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WAVES, Women Approved for Volunteer Emergency Service, and the WAC, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later shortened to Women's Army Corps in 1943. So these women were working within different facets of our war effort in support of the military. Now, there's one group that became part of the US military. Only one of these three. Who wants to guess what it is? Not the WASP. I heard WASP. It was not the WASP. They have a whole other story. It was the WAC. In 1943, FDR signed legislation that dropped auxiliary, which allowed women in the Army to officially become officers and travel abroad in service of the war effort. So they were the only ones that were part of the military by the war's end. So we're going to start with the WAVES here. So the WAVES, Women Approved for Volunteer Emergency Service. This image is actually of a WAVE in the air tower. She's an air traffic controller. And it's actually, this photo is courtesy of the National Archives. So they served as naval aviation training pilots. They served as instructors training naval airmen. They also were air traffic controllers. They tested parachutes. And what's actually interesting about the waves, so they were tied to the Navy. This image here is of a woman in the control tower, and operators received their special training at Naval Air Station Atlanta, Georgia. And the preferred candidate for this job was between 20 and 30 years old, had 20/20 vision, normal visual, auditory, and speaking capabilities, short reaction times, and the ability to perform in stressful situations. She also scored well in mathematics and had good teaching skills. In 1942, the Bureau of Aeronautics actually restricted operator positions to the waves after they recognized that women performed as well or better than their male counterparts. So such integration of women into the naval aviation was largely made possible thanks to Lieutenant Joy Bright Hancock, who worked tirelessly as the waves representative to the Bureau of Aeronautics. World War II marked the Navy's first female doctor, lawyer, bacteriologist, and computer specialist. And a woman named Grace Hopper actually helped develop the Mark I computer as a member of a team assigned to the Harvard University Computation Laboratory during World War II. So these women were working as computers. They were working as control tower operators. They were serving here domestically. So that's also something to be aware of. So the WASP, Women Airforce Service Pilots, show of hands. How many have heard of the WASP? Okay, good. So none of this should be new. So the Women Airforce Service Pilots, these were a group of 1,102 women by the time that they were disbanded in 1944, all of them civilians. They ferried every single type of plane that male service members flew. They towed targets for anti-aircraft training. They oftentimes would ferry a plane, so they're taking it from point A to point B. They would ferry it from, let's say, the Consolidated Airplane Factory in San Francisco down to Houston. They would fly from San Francisco down to Houston, and then they would have to hitch a ride and pay for their own transportation back to San Francisco. So buy their own plane ticket, hitchhike, call a friend. This was before cell phones or Uber or Lyft. So they flew grueling missions. There were 38 of these women that actually died during their service. But because they were not considered part of the US military, they were not permitted to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. So it took, they were disbanded in 1944 because the tide of the war had turned. We had enough planes, we had enough servicemen, we no longer needed women to ferry these planes. We were back to producing the amount of planes that we needed to win the war in Northern Africa. D-Day, ladies and gentlemen. Western Europe had changed. The Pacific was starting to turn. That this group was disbanded. And when they were disbanded, they were not granted veteran status. And Jackie Cochran, complicated person in history, she was their director during the war and actually lobbied against them getting veteran status because it was their patriotic duty. They were doing their patriotic duty. So it actually took until 1977 when President Jimmy Carter signed legislation retroactively granting them veteran status. And not until 2010 when this group of women, after decades and decades of lobbying and advocacy, were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for their service. And many of them, their family members, were the ones that accepted the award because for many of them, they had already passed by that point. So we have a whole program about women in World War II aviation, but the only group, like I mentioned before, that was actually part of the US military by the end of the war were the WAC, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later shortened to the Women's Army Corps. So over 150,000 American women served in the WAC during World War II. Members of the WAC were the first women other than nurses, you might be surprised to know, to serve within the ranks of the U.S. Army. Actually, U.S. Representative Edith North Rogers of Massachusetts introduced a bill for the creation of the WAC with WA, or 2 A's, AA, in May of 1941. And she did this having witnessed the status of women in World War I. And after seeing how women were treated within the realm of veteran status, in the realm of the military, vowed that if America went to war again, women had to be part of the Army. And she worked tirelessly to provide women with those rights and those benefits that American soldiers, men, received. By January of 1943, Representative North Rogers introduced an identical bill, the same one that she did in 41, to both houses of Congress to permit the enlistment and commissioning of women in the U.S. Army or reserve forces as opposed to regular enlistments in the U.S. Army. It's all kind of gobbledygook, but essentially it dropped auxiliary from the name and allowed women to serve overseas to free a man to fight. So they served a lot of times in more administrative roles, but they were still part of aviation history within World War II. But women like Gladys Brooks, who you see in this picture here from Athens, Ohio, she was actually 43 when she joined the WAC during World War II. She had worked for about a decade as a teller in one of the banks down in Athens, Ohio. And this picture here is actually from, I believe, the Philippines. It's from her scrapbook, actually. So she was able to serve overseas, and July 1st, 1943, FDR actually officially dropped auxiliary. So the WAC were the first women outside of nurses to serve within the ranks of the U.S. military. So that kind of leads us, again, whole program about World War II aviation that I can get into. But as we kind of leap forward into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we start to see some changes happening. We know historically that after World War II, we see this notion when we're in World War I, when we're in World War II, that women were joining predominantly male-dominated professions and arenas during the war. Well, then after the war, okay, take a step back. The boys are back in town. Go over here, right? So as we're getting into the 1950s, what do we know that's going on? The 1950s, we have Korea. 1960s, we have the space race and the Cold War and containment of communism, and then we see Vietnam. All of this is just like percolating, and like it's almost a perfect storm that, okay, we need to have more opportunities for women, but not combat. We're still not at that phase yet until the 70s. But one woman, I don't see faces that were at our program on Friday night, March 24th, but one woman who we actually welcomed to the museum last week for our Dinner with a Slice of History program is Sandra DURBIN. How many have you heard of Sandra DURBIN? Shakes, some nods. You guys don't count because you come to our programs. Sandra DURBIN, she is a firecracker. I love her so much. Sandra DURBIN, she was the first Black female air traffic controller in the United States and the United States Navy in 1967. Now, she was raised in Riverside, California. She actually was not encouraged by her mother or other members of her family outside of her grandmother to do something with her life. She was a gifted student. She attended a segregated school in, Riverside, California. And she's the first person in her family to graduate from high school. And she joined the Navy predominantly because she wanted to get as far away from her mom as possible and as far away from home. And the Navy provided that opportunity to go to like Maryland. So after completing her initial boot camp training in 1966, she had a choice: go to air school or go and become like a technician, like working within like electronics. She actually chose air school because it was a shorter program. Now she, as you can imagine, okay, what's happening in the 1960s? Let's think about it. What's happening here at home as well? The civil rights movement. I believe it was 1968 that Dr. King was assassinated? She was in the Navy when that happened. Now she actually was told, she arrived when she was assigned to Naval Air Station Pensacola. She was assigned to her post, and as soon as she arrived, she didn't even get a chance to call her mom to say, I arrived safely, before she was called before her superiors. So she shows up, she's like 19 years old. She is in full dress uniform. She's been called to I believe it was a quartermast, and was told, well, white women are stupid, so what the hell does that make you? So Sandra, she took that as a challenge. She's like, you don't tell me what I can and can't do. I'm going to show you what I can do. She had that same type of tenacity in air school as well. Before she was even assigned to Pensacola, they told her the same thing. White women are dumb. They can't do this, so what the hell does that make you? Why don't you just go home? Why don't you just go find a job as a housekeeper, as a cleaner? She graduated third in her class from air school. And she graduated third because she broke a toe. Like she fell off her bed and broke a toe. So it kind of set her back a little bit. But she went on and she served for 2 years within the Navy. That's what she had signed up for. And she had been accepted to FAA school. So even though she was a well-known, well-respected air traffic controller in the Navy, at that time, there was no smooth transition from military life to civilian life. There was no system like what we have now, that transition. There are fewer barriers and everything. But by 1969, there was the scuttlebutt that the first air traffic control, like air strike was gonna happen in the FAA. And she's like, I'm not gonna go and get into all of that and then not have a job. So as she jokes, she took a 15-year temporary gig working for the telephone company, where she became one of the first women in California to climb telephone poles and install switchboards for the telephone company. So she actually, Sandra, currently is the California Department of AMVET's commander. So she is the commander of all of the state of California, and she is there advocating and supporting, providing services to American veterans. And AMVETS is the only veterans organization where you don't have to have fought in overseas or fought in an active battle. So long as you have an honorable discharge, AMVETS is there for you. So she is one that, gosh, I could talk for days about her, but we don't have time. And we did record our program, our Dinner with a Slice of History from last Friday, that we, by like the end of this year, if I can get around to it, we will be posting to our YouTube channel. So you're welcome to check that out. And she's also, I've already talked to her, she's gonna be coming back to Ohio again because we just love her so much. Another woman who in the 70s was breaking barriers was Brenda Robinson. So her call sign actually was Raven, and she became the first African-American woman certified for a C-1A carrier on board delivery carrier landings on the USS America, and that was in 1981. but she was actually selected as one of 10 women nationwide to attend the Navy's Aviation OCS, Officer Candidate School. And she became the first African American woman to graduate from Aviation OCS. So this is, say you have a college, for those of you who are unfamiliar, if you graduate from college, you can go into OCS and then you can become an officer and begin climbing those ranks. So it's a higher level than simply enlisting. Her entire career actually was peppered with firsts for African American women, especially in the U.S. Navy. She was the first flight instructor, evaluator, and VIP transport pilot, just to name a few of the firsts during her military career. In 1992, she transitioned into the Naval Reserves and was actually hired by American Airlines. She was among the first African American female pilots at American Airlines and flew with them for 17 years aboard Boeing 727s, 757s, and 767s. So she actually now runs a camp, if you will, for young women, especially in North Carolina, to explore careers within aviation, whether it's starting in the military or going and getting certified as an aviation mechanic. Because that's something, I picked the wrong career, people. I should have gone into manufacturing and aviation manufacturing, because there's an entire group in Youngstown that is doing 3D printing of commercial airplane seats. Did you guys know that? I just found this out. But that's something that Brenda Robinson is exposing these young minds to, of all of the different possibilities. So she is a trailblazer. So Brenda Robinson, she began her career as an officer in 1977. That was the same year, if you remember me talking about the WASP. This is the history minute, PSA. So 1977, again, we're looking back at World War II. 33 years after the WASP, the Women Airforce Service Pilots, were disbanded, was when President Jimmy Carter signed into legislation with H.R. 3277 the retroactive veteran status for these women in recognition for their service, because they were being fired on, but they couldn't fire back. They were not given access to things like the GI Bill or VA benefits for medical or anything like that. So it was all part of this reconciliation process. By this time in the 70s as well, we start to see the Equal Rights Amendment being reintroduced, that in the 19-teens and 1920s, Alice Paul, suffragist, had originally presented. We start to see that women's movement building steam. So it was like that perfect storm. In the 70s also was when we saw the first time that women were flying within the U.S. Air Force. Now, they were not in combat roles, they were not in test pilot roles, but they were starting to fly. If you watched the Super Bowl this year, there was an all-female flight crew, and that was celebrating the 50th anniversary of women flying within the Air Force. So, a lot of things were happening in the 70s as well. We also start to see, from a larger historical context here, that in the 1970s, the U.S., quote unquote, won the space race. And we're trying to start recruiting for our shuttle program to begin in the 80s. So by 1978, we had the first women in our astronaut corps selected. There were 35 members, but 6 of them were women. So we start to see that evolution there and that broadening of opportunities. And one of the women who was part of our shuttle era, who is actually in July, was Sunita Williams. Sunny Williams, she actually was born in Euclid, Ohio, We have her shirt on exhibit. That was a little barter agreement that we had with her. She wanted some Great Lakes beer, and we wanted her shirt, so we did a little exchangey poo there. But she's also visited the museum. Like, she's one of the nicest people that you can ever meet. But she actually received her commission as an ensign in the U.S. Navy from the Naval Academy in 1987. She was designated as a naval aviator in 89 and was assigned to the Helicopter Combat Support Squadron 8 in Norfolk. During her service, she was deployed to the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf in support of Desert Shield and Operation Provide Comfort. She was selected for the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School, which, like, that's a big deal to be selected for the test pilot school, and not just in the Navy, but in becoming any type of test pilot. We have a whole other program, Quest for the Stars, that talks about, like, our space program, because she's gone to space. It's a big deal. So in '93, she was selected for that Naval Test Pilot School and later served as an instructor. When she was deployed on the USS Saipan, she was notified that she was selected for the NASA astronaut program, and that was in 1988. She flew 2 long-duration missions to the International Space Station, and that means, like, between 5 and 6 months. That's considered a long-duration mission, and became the second female commander of the space station in 2012. She, like I mentioned, she donated this shirt to us. She ran the Boston Marathon while in space. That's a whole separate contraption on how that happens when there's zero gravity, and how do you run a marathon when there's no gravity? There's a treadmill that's literally on the ceiling, but because there's no gravity, you get to be strapped into this really weird looking harness to provide opposite pressure. That was developed here in Cleveland. Maybe that'll be a trivia question. I haven't actually come up with the trivia questions for next month yet. We'll see. But one of the things about Sunny, she's going back to space, but not aboard a NASA shuttle, not aboard a SpaceX Dragon, which is taking our astronauts to the ISS now. She is going to be on the Boeing Starliner commercial crew. So NASA, this is one of the cool things about our gig at the International Women's Air and Space Museum. Things are changing so quickly. It's also very daunting because things are changing so quickly that Boeing is one of NASA's commercial partners, just like SpaceX, that by 2030, the International Space Station is going to be decommissioned. By 2030, our commercial partners should have their own lower Earth orbit stations that NASA will be able to utilize because we're going back to the moon. Artemis 2 is scheduled for 2024. And that's just going to orbit the moon. By 2026, we're going to be on the moon. So Sunny might be part of that. But she is going to be on that first crewed Boeing Starliner flight. We are hoping that it happens in July, but you know what? Boeing is having a fun time right now with actually having successful launches. So fingers crossed that she gets to go. Another woman that has been a part of our space program that has had a career within the military is Eileen Collins. Show of hands, Eileen Collins. Eileen Collins graduated from the U.S. Air Force undergraduate pilot training program, Advanced Air Force Base, in 1979, where she was a T-38 instructor pilot until 1982. From 1983 to 85, she was a C-141 aircraft commander and an instructor pilot at Travis Air Force Base. She was then assigned to the U.S. Air Force Academy, where she was an assistant professor of mathematics and a T-41 instructor pilot. You know, she's doing a lot of teaching, this woman. She must be an academic of sorts, if you think about it. She was selected for the NASA astronaut program while attending the Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base, from which she graduated in 1990. Collins flew 4 space shuttle missions. She became the first female pilot of a shuttle in 1995 and the first woman to command a shuttle mission in 1999. Her flight in 1995, when she became the first woman to pilot a shuttle, she invited the remaining members of the living members of what we call the Mercury 13. You know what I'm gonna ask? Show of hands. Mercury 13. Ooh, smaller percentage. Okay, so the Mercury 13, two of them are still alive. The Mercury 13 is the name that we now associate with the unofficial NASA, like NASA wanted nothing to do with this program, the Women in Space program, to test women to see if they had what it took to become astronauts. They had to swallow 3 feet of rubber tubing. Still don't know why, but they did. They were put through inertia machines. They were put in psychological tests. Some women who were initially recruited for that program were disqualified because they had, quote, abnormal brain waves. So of course you freak out when you hear, oh my gosh, I have abnormal brain waves? What's happening? And their doctors are like, there's nothing wrong with you. But they were disqualified because of that. But the group of women in the Women in Space program of 1960 and 1961, when this was happening, never got a chance to fly to space. But women like Eileen Collins, like Sunny Williams, like Pam Melroy, who was only the 5th woman to serve as Deputy NASA Administrator, and she flew with the Air Force, they credit the Mercury 13 with showing them that, hey, we can withstand these tests and we have what it takes. So Eileen Collins invited the remaining members of that group to her launch. And that included Myrtle Cagle, that included Wally Funk, who is the oldest woman to have gone to space at age 82. She flew on July 20th, 2021. We thought it was a hoax, and then we found out it was not a hoax, so we got very excited. But she invited these women because she's like, you weren't able to fly. I'm doing this in honor of you. I'm piloting this. I'm a pilot. You were all pilots. We're making progress. It might have taken 30 plus years, but we're getting there. So Eileen Collins is, I believe, now retired from NASA. But that gets us to kind of start segueing into the 90s to now. So my lifetime. Meryl Tengsdahl graduated from the University of New Haven in 1994 with a degree in electrical engineering and went on to attend OCS, Officer Candidate School, for the Navy, commissioned as an ensign in September 1994, and attended flight training shortly after. She recalled in an interview that during the mid-90s, the military had just begun opening more roles for women in combat. Now remember, women could fly in the 70s, but not in combat. By the 90s, 20 years later, progress is slow, right? We know that it operates at a snail's pace. But Tengsdahl said that combat pilot was one of those opportunities. There was also a massive push for more minorities into the pilot training program. And she remembered when she attended flight training, it was a racially diverse group, which she was actually surprised to see, even in the mid-90s. She said it was a good feeling. However, I could tell there were a few people who didn't appreciate us being there. Women, African Americans, even into the 90s. But like Sandra Durbin before her in '67, she did not let that deter her. The first aircraft that Meryl Tengsdahl flew was the Navy's SH-60B Seahawk helicopter, used for anti-submarine warfare, search and rescue, anti-ship warfare, and special ops. She loved the versatility of the aircraft and its capabilities. In 2004, she qualified to fly one of the most difficult aircraft in the world, the U-2 stealth bomber. Tengsdahl joins only 5 women and 3 African Americans, male or female, to ever participate in the U-2 program. She has flown missions for Operation Olive Harvest in Afghanistan and Iraq, and took part in helping combat piracy in the Horn of Africa. She has more than 3,400 flight hours and more than 330 combat hours. She is now a personal trainer as well, and she's not one to mess with. But with the U-2, you are almost in space. And just to be able to see the curvature of the Earth and just realize that, like, Bessie Coleman, she said that the air is the only place free of prejudice. And to see in a U-2 the curvature of the Earth, that's what the first time she flew, Meryl Tengsdahl recalled, I remembered Bessie's words. So we're not going to stop there. We still have more folks to talk about. So remember when I asked who knew Amanda Lee? No one raised your hand. Amanda Lee. Okay, where do I start? Amanda Lee, in July of 2022, the U.S. Navy Blue Angels demonstrations team announced that they would welcome their first F-18 female fighter pilot to that demonstrations team. Her name, Amanda Lee, call sign, Stalin. Don't ask me why. Like, you just get assigned your call sign. Like, apparently my call sign is Coffee Queen. This is what happens when I say I'm obsessed with coffee, air show weekend. Hers is Stalin, like Joseph Stalin, that one. Which really, like, Stalin in Russian means steel. So, like, you can look at it both ways. So she actually is not the first woman to work with the Blues, but she is the first female pilot in its 55 plus year history. To put this into context, the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds, so if you've been to the air show here in Cleveland, we alternate years. So this last year was the Blue Angels, but they announced that she was assigned and earned the spot on the team in July, so she didn't perform this year. But next time, I'm already bugging Kim, the director of the Cleveland National Air Show. I'm like, can we? She's like, yes, I have a post-it note on my desk. Yes, you guys get to meet her. But the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds, in, I believe it was 2005 or 2007, I can't remember which, they announced that NICOLE Malachowski would become their first female demonstrations pilot. So it took 10 more years, but the Navy is starting to catch up. The Air Force has been a little bit more progressive and faster moving historically with integration there. But Lee is actually from Mounds View, Minnesota, and worked for UPS while at the University of Minnesota Duluth before enlisting in the Navy. She was an aviation electronics technician she got a degree from Old Dominion University and has a bachelor's in biochemistry. She was deployed to the USS Harry Truman in 2016 when she was designated as a naval aviator. So she is already starting to make, sorry for the pun, waves within the Navy and aviation, but she's a first, but she's not going to be the last. So we're very excited to welcome her back to Cleveland next time the Blues are here. So excited. Another woman who has served her country, but she's gone to space recently, is Kayla Barron. She was commissioned as a naval officer in 2010. She attended the U.S. Navy's nuclear power and submarine officer training before being assigned to the USS Maine, an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. She qualified as a submarine warfare officer and completed 3 strategic deterrent patrols while serving as a division officer aboard the Maine. At the time of her selection as a NASA astronaut, she was serving as the flag aide to the superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy. She was a flight engineer on Expedition 66 to the International Space Station. That last sentence is wrong. Just realized that, sorry. She came back to Earth over a year ago. Just realized that that's wrong. But she was aboard the International Space Station for a long duration mission, and she is just starting her career. She's in her late 20s, early 30s. So there's a lot ahead of this young woman and officer, and she's been named to the Artemis program. So she could be going back to the moon sometime. She may not be. We don't know. We don't know who's going to be the first woman or the first person of color on the moon yet. On Monday, we find out who's going to be on Artemis 2 in 2024 that's going to orbit the moon and do studies. But we don't, that could be Kayla Barron. We don't know. That's why I have one of my trustees like on it, because I'm like, I'm taking Monday off, people. Marcy gets to watch NASA TV and then text me what's happening. So Kayla Barron is one. Another woman is General Jacqueline Van Ovost. So Brigadier General Jacqueline Van Ovost is still serving, actually. She is not a veteran. She is still serving and is the highest ranking woman in the US military. She actually earned a pilot's license and flew to the airport to watch from her plane Sally Ride launch to space 40 years ago this year, wearing a Ride Sally Ride t-shirt. So Jacqueline Van Ovost, after a delayed entry into the Air Force Academy because of not doing enough of the pull-ups to meet the requirement, she graduated with a degree in aeronautical engineering. Despite years of flying experience and taking a test pilot short course, the Air Force at the time still wouldn't let her in the cockpit of a combat jet. So after graduating from undergraduate pilot training, she asked to fly every single fighter in the fleet and was told to fly an airlifter. She later would qualify and prove to her superiors that she could be a test pilot anyway. So since becoming a brigadier general and throughout her career within the Air Force, she has been fighting for greater access. She has successfully convinced the US military that even things like how you cut your hair, and you have, for a woman, if you have longer hair, it doesn't have to be like pulled all the way back. That will give you migraines and affect your vision and not fit nicely into your helmet, to lessen some of those strict requirements. She's also been instrumental in the change within the military that when Sandra DURBIN joined the Navy in 1966, if you had children, you got discharged, you got kicked out. If you got married, you got kicked out. It's changed now. You can have families, you can have a personal life. And General Van Ovost has been an integral part in changing the flight suits as well. So women who are in service and who are pregnant can still fly until later into their pregnancy before having to officially say, all right, this critter, it needs some time, needs some breath. I need to not fly these jets right now. So one more woman we'll talk about here very quickly is NICOLE MANN. NICOLE MANN just came back down from the International Space Station. She is a U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel, and she became the first Native American woman in space and only the second Native American full stop in space. She just came back, like I said, from the International Space Station after serving 6 months up there, a part of Crew 5. And she is both a fighter and test pilot and the first woman to command a commercial crew SpaceX vehicle. So that's one of our NASA's commercial partners. She's a member of the Wailaki of the Round Valley Indian tribes of Northern California. And she actually participated in an EVA, so a spacewalk. She has been named to the Artemis program, so she could also be the first woman and/or the first person of color to step foot on the moon. She actually was hesitant when the opportunity came about to even apply to become an astronaut. And it was her husband who's like, you miss every shot you don't take. Why not? The worst they can say is no, but just look at your career already. And she was selected. So we're excited to see everything that she does as well, because she just flew on her first mission to space. And while she was aboard the International Space Station, she was doing over 200 experiments in the 6-month time frame, including figuring out how to grow dwarf tomatoes. Why grow dwarf tomatoes, Sarah? Well, let me tell you. Do you like salad? Do you like fresh produce? How long does it take to get from Earth's moon to Mars? If you guess 6 months, you're right. How long does it take to get from Earth to the moon? About a week. And then you're going to sit there and figure out, like, okay, so do we have enough fuel? Do we need to do this? Do we need to do this? Like, let's get acclimated. Let's figure out our flight plan before you actually take off to Mars. So you're already at, let's say 11 months, factoring in some flexibility because it's space. And then you're gonna maybe orbit Mars for a few weeks. And then you're gonna come back. You're already over a year in space, and we can't get you deep dish pizza from Chicago easily. Nutrition. So they're figuring out how to grow lettuce, dwarf tomatoes. What is the radiation in space gonna do to your body? That's a whole nother story. But those were some of the tests that she and her fellow astronauts were testing. So there's so much happening within our military history, within our current events, within our US military, as it's tying in with space, as it's tying in with our national defense and our entertainment with, the example of Amanda Lee and our Blue Angels, US Navy Blue Angels, and US Thunderbirds. But one of the things that I've gotten asked a lot when I do these programs is, what can we do to make these stories more widely known and support our military veterans? Well, selfishly, join as a member of the International Women's Air and Space Museum, because it's our duty, it's our job. The public, our communities have entrusted us with preserving their stories. So your membership, donations help us preserve collections items, provide educational opportunities, share these women's stories, conduct that research, and really build those relationships, but also volunteer and give to our homeless shelters, because the fastest growing population of our homeless are especially female veterans. That is in all 50 states. So give to them. If you have the ability and work with any other community organizations, see if you can partner with AMVETS, like Sandra DURBIN is the California commander. We have an Ohio commander. There's also a Pennsylvania commander. There are commanders all over, and they're posts all over for AMVETS. But also get to know the organization Mission Continues. That is a national organization. We have a regional branch out of Columbus, Ohio, actually, that services all of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Indiana, and Michigan. And the Mission Continues is literally what it is. The mission continues. It is a transitionary organization that helps our American servicemen and women continue that mission-driven purpose in their life, so that they are able to connect with community organizations and they're able to feel that sense of community as they're transitioning out of military life and structure. So those are like the questions that I get asked a lot when I do these programs. What can we do to preserve these women's stories, to support our veterans communities, to support each other really as a community? So those are some of my suggestions. Thank you everyone so much, and if you have any questions, you can always reach out and come down and visit us. Thank you.